Dale Kubitschek put in 28 years with the Eaton Corporation and was a National Fleet Service Manager before retiring, so he knows a thing or two about transmissions. Dale, thanks for being here.
Glad to be here.
Dale is going to help demonstrate proper shifting techniques and show you some of the damage improper shifting can cause to your transmission. Dale, let's go inside and take a look.
Let's do it.
Okay, Dale, show us some damaged parts.
Sure, Jim. Let's take a look at this input shaft. This failure was more than likely caused when a driver improperly shifted the transmission, trying to force the gear out of synchronization. What can happen is a crack can develop in the shaft, which will ultimately lead to this type of failure. Another example is this main shaft. If you're looking at it, you wouldn't think there's anything wrong with it. However, if you take the sliding clutch, is what you shift with, line it up on the splines, this should slide up and down like this. However, if it gets back down here, it hangs up and won't go up or down, and this will cause a hard shifting complaint.
Now, a lot of these failures are caused by a condition called shock load. What exactly is shock load?
Well, it can happen when a driver starts out in too high of a gear, or if he gets a little bit nervous when his truck is starting to roll backwards and his clutch comes out too quickly. Or another example of it would be backing into a dock too hard, or in the winter when his wheels are spinning on ice and then all of a sudden they hit drive payment. And that can lead us into what we call drastic shock load. You take for this gear, for example, it can lead to cracking teeth or tearing the teeth out like you see here. This causes severe damage to the transmission, can ruin a drive shaft, and cause extensive damage to a rear end. They're big dollar failures, and it's probably one of the most expensive failures that's caused by improper shifting techniques.
Dale, before we start talking about how to prevent these kinds of failures, let's talk a little bit about lubrication, which is the lifeblood of the transmission.
Sure. Eaton understands the performance benefits of using full synthetic lubricant in the transmission. That's why they recommend using the Road Ranger branded full synthetic lube, because it meets their strict requirements. And it's one of the best investments you can make for long trouble-free performance.
In order to properly operate a transmission, isn't it important that we understand a little bit about the design?
Absolutely. Let's go take a look at the transmission.
Okay.
Okay, what we have here essentially with the transmission is a front box in an auxiliary section or a range section. The front box is controlled, its shifts by the gear shift lever. The auxiliary or the back box is controlled by air, and it's selected by a range control valve that's mounted on top of the shift lever. If we talk about power flow, we come over to the input shaft, and the input shaft is connected to this drive gear, and the drive gear turns these two counter shafts. And we can take and split a tremendous amount of load even though these gears are smaller, as opposed to having one larger single counter shaft. If you take the main shaft, which is not directly connected to the input shaft, power comes in from the input shaft to the engine, splits out to the counter shafts, and it comes into the main shaft gear that's turning.
Dale, when you're up in the cab and you move the shift lever, what you're controlling is the front box of the transmission.
That's correct. What we have is you got the gear shift lever that's connected to the shift fork, and the shift fork is connected down to the sliding clutch. So power comes in from the input shaft to the drive gear, turns the two counter shaft gears, and comes back and turns the main shaft gears. But we still don't have any power flow coming out the front box of the transmission. So what ends up happening is you have got to get the speed of this gear with this sliding clutch to match. Once that happens, this sliding clutch will engage into the main shaft gear, and then you'll have power flow out the front box.
So Dale, what does the back box of the transmission do?
Well, the difference between the back box here is the sliding clutch here is different from what we had with the sliding clutch in the front box. This sliding clutch has got a synchronizer with friction material on it. When air is applied to the synchronizer, it moves forward. When it's going into a gear position, it has to match two different speeds. And this friction material, or this friction synchronizer, allows us to do that. So when the air is applied and this synchronizer is forced going into the gear that it wants to go into, will match those two speeds, and at that point in time you get the power flow out the back of the transmission.